Questions for the panel? I'd like to get the conversation started.
I have a question. My name is Greg Cox. I'm from College Atlantic in Maine, and I have a question for Karina. I'm wondering if you might comment on your thoughts about the kind of model of national identity that Bolivians and others have been proposing, that it aims at being plurinational. And in some ways, South Africa is another interesting sort of a case. In some other ways, Europe is another interesting case where people are challenging or trying to move beyond a dualistic understanding of nationality. Your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful question. And actually, thank you for mentioning South Africa, because we recently did research with a group of students in South Africa. And what I found is unbelievable, amazing similarities between nation building in Ukraine and South Africa. Unfortunately, the dream of Mandela about rainbow nation does not work there anymore. And we have a lot of polarities, a lot of dualities introduced into these. And major issue is exactly unfinished process of dealing with the past. So they had a negative peace, but justice and reconciliation was never an issue there, unfortunately. And the same, we see unfinished process of transition, unfinished, like post-Soviet countries never did deal with their past. And I don't know if you see now Olympic Games in Russia. I'm probably a little bit more fortunate because I know what they really doing there about in Russian. Because not always translated well into English, but it's all about achievements. And achievements of great Russia and opposition to other countries. So what is important there, that even we have overarching common identities built in many different countries, the issue is that in this situation you will have temporal duality with the past, or you will have national duality with other groups. You always have to create meaning of who we are, you always have to have somebody else, right? You always have to have they, and this, in this situation, these dualities will just move from social group duality into binational or temporal or ideological duality within the nation. So you always will have, this will be the foundation for any national identity, or overarching like European type of identity. You still will have the dualities and still will have the mythic narratives created there, introduced into this. So I just talk to all the time.
Back to narratives, I was very interested in the presentation of the joint paper on particularly focusing on the case of Oakland. There's nothing that grabs me more than actual application of an analysis and a prescriptive process. And I heard of some very, very significant innovations in building some sense of justice and community. I just wanted to mention that I've been working on a project called Toward the Abrahamic Family Reunion, and one of the participants, this was out at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, that there's a very large African American Muslim community. It's not entirely African, but it's led by Fahim Shoaib as the imam. And he's been struggling also to give a sense of ethical meaning to life for the African American community there. And I wonder, in your field work or your research, you've come across this phenomenon. I understand his mosque and community is the second largest one in Northern California. And since it's Oakland, and Oakland's a very big subject, I'd love to hear what you know about it.
Well, thank you. So it brings up the disclaimer that the example, the case is taken from a book called Black Youth Rising by Sean Ginwright. And he is an associate professor, and I'm not exactly sure where, but our theorizing was around the case that he created around his experience with Black youth and children through his organization. So I don't personally have much experience in the community to say that.
I do have a thought on that, and I think it's a really interesting, brings out an important point that we were trying to make in the paper and that actually Day is making. And I thank you for that, Joe. And that has to do with sort of the unbelievably parallel nature of a lot of these social change efforts. So we're not aware, and we'd like to become aware of this work, but it actually highlights what Day was saying, which is that if you move past the reform versus revolution framing, what you see is these sort of almost autonomous, parallel spaces where people are doing social change work, and there's no necessity, Day says, for them to sort of wrap themselves around each other for some totalizing effect. And I think it's another great story that we'd like to learn about. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So, that was a tour de force. As you were going through that, I thought you were basically mapping out a major project culminating in a book in which you apply your various categories. I have really a question of further explanation. Episteme is theory, techne is application, technique. Phonetics, I guess, is the practice. Theory-based practice or theory-based application. And could you say something about where you think ESCART is in terms of overall emphasis? Are we more on the episteme side? Are we less involved on the techne side? Are we doing something about phonetics, where we develop praxis as theory-based, reflective practice? And what proportions do you think apply to all three, where we are now? Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. That's a great question to think about. It's always hard to do proportions, but let me say, I think that we are aspirationally technicians. That is, we really wish, we hope that we are doing things. We imagine ourselves as somehow blending praxis and doing that kind of praxis work. But I think probably it's fair to say that for the most part, we're epistemologists. That is, we're doing, if you look at just the classes themselves, like what do people actually teach? What do they care to teach? They're teaching theories for the most part. The students always say, I want more practice, I want more practice. And that's true, but if they only get practice, why is the university the best place to do that? I think that there's a difference between training and education, right? And so I think training is essential, and people ought to come out trained. But I think that we are really in the bit. I think education, the best way to characterize that would be cultivating the virtue of that frenetic virtue for doing practice. So that's the distinction. That the sort of the excellence is phronesis, and the activity you want to do is praxis. And I think that what we all want to do, I think in a sense, if we were to this is the important thing, not to blend them and say you're doing the same at the same time. That's what I think, if there's one lesson that I would say is important, is to say we have to place the accent on one or the other at different moments and not think that somehow we're going to be able to culminate. By the way, that dotted line thing, that's Andrea Bartoli who put the dotted line. And I was suspicious of that. And the reason is because I don't think that we can get the student all the way there. I think what we can do is prepare them to know how to think, to do research and to understand the canons and conventions at the highest level. We can also get them trained to do things, and that we can do better at that. I think we should do better at that. But I don't think that we can actually craft the character of the student and plan their life course, and we shouldn't try. And so I think in a way, probably too much emphasis on the episteme, not enough on the techne, but in a sense we're not doing everything we could be doing because of that. And I think if we were somehow just get on the same page and be I'm teaching someone how to write a good article, how to really make a good analysis. And that's just what I'm going to be better at, frankly. and to accept that others, and to celebrate them, who are going to be able to get them to actually get in and do a problem-solving workshop. That's something that I think that we, and I'd like to learn more about, but I think that's a separate kind of activity that's benefited by that really sound social science awareness. That's my
This is also for Sullen. What strikes me in the context of this Saturday is I see epistemology, I see technique, I see the microphone, I see practice. I know the book of Aristotle's out of which Phronesis came, being a victim of the University of Chicago.
both of us, such victims.
What I don't see in your discussion, interestingly, is ethics. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great, maybe I didn't tie, I was going so fast I didn't tie it all together. So the whole point of being a phronimos, that is doing phronesis, being engaged in practice, is what the Ploufbier model was about, was to be ethical in what you're doing, to not simply know more, not simply to do a lot of stuff, but to do the right thing. And I think that in a way what we're trying to do, and I think we're not alone in this, I think a lot of the social sciences are becoming aware of this, is that, sociology, my home discipline, is very excited about the notion of public sociology now, after Michael Burawoy's revolutionary discourse at the estate. And they're not very good at it. And we have the first PhD in public sociology here at George Mason. And we just had the first graduate, and she's a wonderful student. But she, in a way, had to carve out her own space and develop her own approach to public sociology on her own and through external resources. I just don't think that the traditional science, that the logis is what I call them, that they're not very good at this, because here's the point. The logos, the way that we imagine it, is an epistemological concept for the most part. I mean, I think that the idea of there being a sociology, an anthropology, a psychology, is physics envy. And I think that we just are over that. And by the way, that Freud does talk about physics envy. He actually, he says I envy the physicists. But we shouldn't. We should simply accept our, dare I say, feminine status, or our ability to blend the two, our ability to do yin and yang. We should accept that we are both of these things, and that's what it means to be a good social science practitioner. So I think the ethics of it, and this is something you have to cultivate always in your own work, in situations. Did what I do help, or did it hurt? That's what it would mean to be attentive to situation and context. And also, but not to give up on the idea that, wow, there's some great social science out there, and they could teach us things, and even the methods of quantitative methodology, there's stuff you could never see without looking at it that way. But to not just dwell in that and think that's the pinnacle, that you're done. Because you're not done when you've got that top journal hit or that Oxford book. You've just begun. And that's the ethics piece, and that's why I'm happy for this conference.
All right, another question from the old geezer corner. I think it's mainly for Karina, but it also sort of... The youngest dean ever seen. I'm just wondering about your emphasis on dichotomies. And I've always found, looking at the whole idea of identity, is much more complicated than being either or. Mainly, I think, because we're really a collection of either ors. I'm a Londoner, and you're not. I'm British, Dennis isn't. I'm a European, and Ingrid is as well. But I have so many identities that I'm conscious of, that thinking of myself as being simply one of them isn't, to me, it's a bit of a simple picture. The other thing that sort of struck me about identity was, some of you may know what we call Landon Hancock. Now, Landon actually wrote a very interesting PhD a while ago about Northern Ireland, where he said that one of the interesting things that happened in Northern Ireland, he thinks, over the 20-year period of the Troubles, was that the Northern Irish actually acquired an additional identity, which resulted from the UK going into Europe, And this actually enabled them to think of themselves rather differently at a different level. And that this was something that, was it praxis or was it one of these other Greek terms? I don't know, but it came out, the theoretical idea came out of random doing field work. So in a way, there's a sort of an interaction between doing practical work, developing theories and developing ideas, which is an interaction. It's not a one-way street. Maybe someone would actually like to tell us a bit more about that.
Thank you for wonderful question. And binary structure in no way deny multiplicity of identities. What it's stressing that in situation of production of competing narrative, one duality becomes the leading one. And in this, the stronger is competition, the stronger fight, the more dominant particular duality within identity structure there. And when we speak about the structure of national identity in national identity narrative, Solon knows very well works of Jeffrey Alexander, and there are a list of people who are speaking about dualities. And Jeffrey Alexander came with the idea that there are some constant dualities, liberty, non-liberty, because he did most of his research in democratic societies, and his people who were working on a lot of publications of his students who did a lot of research the same way. He posited that there are some underlying more. That's why I'm presenting this model at this conference. There are underlying moral dualities of good and bad, which we attach to particular dualities, and even you can come and I can come with a list of identities which will unite us or put you and me in opposite way. There are some identities which would put most important values to us in particular time, in particular framework, in particular social situation. And they will be the most important for our relationship. Not in, you know what I mean? We have a lot of course, but there are something where the basic values, the core, the survival of the group attached to particular duality. And it was profound. I was also, in the beginning when I created this theory, I was against this. And I spent enormous amount of time, if you can check in the book, like trying to see how others present duality in their work, in philosophy, and anthropology, and sociology, everywhere. And I found that the most important for me is exactly about this praxis type. The dualities were pouring out of narratives. They're just pouring out of narratives. Even people have different ideas who they are, multiplicities of identities. This deepest, incorporated, value-related idea of us and them created the whole narrative. And then you have a lot of myths which justify it, you have a different normative orders, but exactly because national narrative is deeply connected to power and competition for power and resources. That's why duality becomes one of the most important.
Last question.
Anyway, thank you for a very interesting panel. And I have, I guess, a formulation or a synthesis that ties together all the themes that were presented. And so my background's clinical and political psychology, and I've been involved in the International Society of Political Psychology since 1985. And I'm very close to the ideas and the people that Joe was talking about. But in terms of, and the basic framework is human development and trauma, and related to trauma and generational transmission of trauma. But like when we talk about dualism and all those things, well, when people are traumatized, they regress psychologically and become concrete thinking and have the underlying psychological process is splitting. And that if you're traumatized, that you can't integrate the opposites, and that's what's going on. And also there's a relation to theory and practice of how, understanding the phenomenon that's going on. So it's like concrete thinking, humiliation is all related to that, and terror management theory, that when people are threatened, they regress to more primitive and in-group, out-group splitting. And also nationalism is associated with conformist stage of development where you haven't constructed the individual or you can't identify with humanity and past that. And so anyway, that also relates to the counter narrative. And anyway, so I think in terms of political therapy, and that in conflict resolution, conflict transformation, that there's knowledge and practice from experience of therapy that, you know, like Vomit and Joe were talking about, that relates to our ability to heal the trauma, and also the idea of truth, how we precisely redesign truth and reconciliation processes.
I think it's wonderful comment, and this is really telling us that to heal traumatic experiences of different groups, especially if we engage in all this post-traumatic situation, then it's really important to understand mechanisms. Not just tell, yes, they had a trauma, they had a situation, I have to understand mechanisms, but I was really interested in go deeper into it and see how mythic narratives work, what dualities are represented there. And it's really given ideas to approach deeper into such new techniques like agonistic dialogue or shared society, which really helping us to move beyond usual conception of multiculturalism or just the dialogue. And these agonistic ideas really helping us to deal with all mechanisms incorporated into this opposition.
I want to jump in really quickly too, because this notion of political therapy touches on what Sarah and I were talking about earlier in relation to von Vulcan, and this is the interesting tension. So Jeff Alexander, you mentioned Jeff Alexander. Jeff Alexander doesn't like von Vulcan's work all that much, and I think part of it is a misunderstanding. But the nature of the misunderstanding is disciplinary division. Chris, you talk about divisions. Well, and we step up, and I'm this, I'm that, and that. Scientifically, we come from these tribes. Well, I think that ethics becomes really crucial when you do political therapy because it's quite different, because you're pushing your own agenda too. You know, that's the real challenge, because what political therapy means, a lot of it is doing stuff like this, going in the media, you know, Richard on Al Jazeera recently, I mean, going out and pushing an agenda, and then you have to say to yourself, when I do that, what is the result of that kind of thing? Because I think narrative interventions, let's put it this way, if it's not about the individual mourning, but it's actually about transforming the narrative, which is where I think the whole school is kind of gravitating. We're kind of gravitating toward realizing what I call the socio-cultural side of things rather than the psychosocial side. I mean, they come together, they're micro-foundations, but I think they are, you can come from the top down, from the semiotic down toward the biological, you can go biological up. I feel like the criticism of psychoanalysis is that it gets into narrative from the biological side. Now, whether that may be fair or not, but that's the caricature of it. The caricature from the sociological, and I can tell you from the top down of sociology community, is that von Vulcan and the entire approach to psychoanalysis and so on is trapped in the individualistic understanding. I'm not so sure that's true, but there probably are some legacies of that kind. And so I think that when we start to do narrative transformation, it becomes all that more important to be really attentive to the idea, are we talking about the truth here, or are we talking about the story? And maybe there's no difference. But I think if you're talking about the truth thing kind of comes through and sort of dominates. And so I just think that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, can I have a quick comment? And then Joe, you could really go wild. I'm again healing. I'm against it. As a strategy, or as a project, or as a program, or as a practice, or as an aspiration of our field, I'm totally opposed to it. And the reason for that is that it requires some kind of knowledge about what it means to be whole, that then is trotted out and done to people. Now, maybe that's an extreme statement, because in the best of all possible worlds, it may be done with people, which is why Allison and I really wanted to take this notion of participation out for a ride, you know, because I think that the whether or not we're actually doing it to or with, and what does it mean to do with, and what does it mean to impose these models, and what does it mean, what's our version, you know, therapy is really about wholeness, and you have to have a version, you have to have a description of what whole means, and I'm not in charge of that, you know, and I would hope that our field isn't in charge of that. That's what I worry about with this aspiration of healing trauma. I don't think it's so great, but you know, I'm also just saying that just to be pesky, to see what happens here in the room, and I know Joe is going to say something interesting.
I know Joe will say something interesting, and I hope short. Okay.
No, Sarah, you've earned the right to be pesky. And there is a lot of misunderstanding. Healing for me is So I was sort of brought into this field by psychiatrists who were professional therapists. They weren't doing things to people. At least these were old-fashioned psychiatrists who believed in listening and involving with people who are traumatized and hurt, and helping them get to a place where it doesn't hurt so much, or whether they can complete a mourning process. It's not being done to them. It is facilitating a process that they are total participants in. But on the issue of healing historical memory, I deliberately chose that title for my unfunded program at SCAR. That you can do that if you're not funded. I wanted to respond to Chris's point about various level components of identity. And Northern Ireland, I've worked a lot on Northern Ireland, and I think the idea of an additional identity like European had some utility. But Northern Ireland, first of all, had a lot of grassroots level community building and peace building between Catholics and Protestants. But there was a very significant event, it's one of the most concrete in Ireland, when Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, actually acknowledged and expressed remorse for England's role in the potato famine in 1946-48. That was a classic example of acknowledgement and contrition. And I spoke to people in the Republic as well as in Northern Ireland, and they thought that the fact that an apology, a formal apology, acknowledgement and apology on 10 Downing Street stationery had a very important psychological impact. Also, the fact that he proposed a monument to the dead in Liverpool, because Liverpool had a huge cemetery. Cemeteries are very big in my field. Honoring the dead and acknowledging the losses and the memories that make up that transgenerational memory. And I'd just like to point out that 700 years of border warfare between Scotland and England are coming to the surface now in referendum over whether Scotland's going to really get its revenge against England. Now that didn't have to happen this way if there was in place a process of walking through history, getting all the expressions of pain and loss and memory and injustice, and facilitating a negotiated new relationship based on acknowledging past wrongs and expressing remorse where appropriate. And that comes from the people who are in the conflict, not the third parties who are doing the work.
We're going to have to stop.
What? Right, no, absolutely. There is, no one's left out. No one's left out. That's the whole beauty of this process. Yeah. Yeah, but see, that the thing is, the memory doesn't go away. It has to be healed. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Joe, I didn't know about your unfunded project, but what did get funded is lunch.